We're not doing this for corporate social responsibility. This isn't something that's a good thing to write in your annual report of what you do. It is fundamental economics. And I think we should remind ourselves that from a competitiveness point of view on talent, if you can't figure this out and figure out how to get more women being successful in your organizations, you will not be successful. And that was banged home massively in the CEO discussions. When we'd ask people, well, what's the rationale for it? It was almost getting laughed at. Like, why do you even ask that stupid question? It's so obvious. It's economically driven. It's about competitiveness. From a US productivity point of view, if we do not increase the participation rate of women in the workforce, our GDP growth will be less. And as I mentioned last night, 25% of the GDP that we have today that was built over the last 40 years comes from women coming into the workforce. So it's an economic priority that we actually get this right. Second one is this notion of focusing on the middle. It's the middle stupid is kind of how I looked at it when I saw it. That's where we need to be focusing on the efforts. And a lot of the activities occurring there, and that's where we're losing most of the women through the process. And that's where we need to focus the efforts. And some organizations seem to do it better than others. And we think that the impact in terms of getting more women in leadership roles is 10 times higher by focusing on that level than it is by focusing at the C-suite level or when you get to the SVP side of it. So the intensity, we think, of the effort has to go into that middle as we go through it. One of the things that we found most interesting about the middle is when you look at the staff line mix and you compare men and women, it's actually quite similar from entry level to manager. It's like 1% off. Where you start to see the big gap is after director and VP. You all of a sudden see a big shift, so that a big difference between women in staff and line roles on that side. And that's my third sort of takeaway, if you will. It's line versus staff. And I think it's key that we look for opportunities to give women line roles earlier in terms of their experiences in the organization. I think the default is people go into staff roles, and there's nothing wrong with staff roles, but it's difficult to then, we think, move from staff up into the CEO role if you haven't had some line experience. Some of the things we saw companies do on that side were actually giving women more, not only line experiences, but international experiences early on in their career. Some organizations talked about promoting women earlier into roles. Again, not trying to break the meritocracy, but just thinking carefully about how can we get women into a role so we can keep them, so even if they do leave and they do want to have children, they've got something they can anchor back to it. The fourth takeaway that I took from it was around sponsorship. I think we cannot say that enough, but sponsorship is critical. And you see this in terms of the attitudes that women versus men have in terms of the ability to be able to advance. And having sponsorship, people who can help protect you when you're taking risks and so forth, is critical. We think the CEO needs to take ownership of that and be a sponsor themselves, but also have other line managers. And it's something that's measurable. In those top 12 companies, the CEO actually measured the number of women that line people were actually sponsoring. It was actually a performance metric. There is a difference between CEOs who say that this gender diversity issue is an important issue from those that actually walk the talk and drive it through the place. And it's the intensity with which those leaders talk about it. It isn't kind of, let's have Women's Day and talk about how we're doing on women. It's actually in the line role. How are we actually doing on this? The only thing I would just say in closing is I think I'm very optimistic about what needs to happen. And I think there's a lot that we can all learn from each other as we go through it. But I think, again, the opportunity is huge.